All right, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Future Ear Radio Podcast. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Jennifer Micacci. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, wanted to have you on as an audiologist who, a practice owner who's now scaled their practice from one clinic to three clinics. I thought it would be really interesting to just kind of hear your career trajectory and arc. So why don't we go back to the start with your story? How did you find your way into audiology?
Okay. Sort of in a roundabout way, I had graduated and maybe a little different than the typical path. My undergrad degree is in communication and had graduated with that degree sort of thinking I may go into media, journalism type. My minor was political science, so I had this real kind of interest in news and news media, things like that. But didn't find a clear sort of path to get into it, and ended up working retail. So I was in retail management, which wasn't my first choice, and thought, I'm not. I'm not doing this for the rest of my life, and decided, I'm going to go back to school. But I didn't know at that point in time really what I wanted to pursue. So took a couple of years off and waitressed and kind of researched different pathways. And during that process, I was taking some sign language classes. And in that program, it was a full interpreting program. I knew I didn't have sort of the personality to be an interpreter, but learned more about the deaf culture and the deaf world. And in one of those classes, they talked about audiology, and it really piqued my interest. As a young person growing up, one of my best friends, her brother was deaf, so it always sort of fascinated me. And he was kind enough when I was in this interpreting program to take me into a deaf club so I was the only hearing person in, a room full of people who were deaf, who were signing. And so I was the one that had communication issues in that environment. And so it was really eye-opening to me and gave me a different perspective. And so, I started researching programs in the state, and I ended up at Southern Connecticut State University, which now has audiology as part of their speech program, but doesn't have a doctoral program. UConn is the only one in our state now. But it was a very small program, so we got really individualized attention, and I felt like I have found what I was looking for. So was able to kind of foster my passion and learn what about audiology I enjoyed, which it always kind of happened to be hearing aids. Really had a big interest in that. And then worked in ENT offices for a long time in the early part of my career. Stopped when I had very young kids, and I actually took about an 8-year hiatus from working. And during that time, contemplated, do I really want to go back? Life was changing, and So to give you a frame of reference, when that happened, digital hearing aids were just coming on the scene. So the Wide Extenso. This is a long time. And so hearing aids at that point in time, they were really pretty primitive. We had screwdrivers. We had a couple of things that we could change. We did rely on real ear measurements really to show us what those hearing aids were doing. You had to know that. So that's where my background in real ear came, knowing the difference real ear made at that point in time. But it was frustrating to work with hearing aids. There was only so much we could do for people, and feedback was a constant battle. And so the technology was not on our side at that point in time. What we had, and we could help people the best we could. So the ENT I worked for, once my daughter was about 5, going into kindergarten, and I had more time, my youngest daughter, the ENT that I had previously worked for needed some help, and he said, you can do any hours you want to do. And it's like, okay, I might as well. I needed some adult mental stimulation. And so, and as soon as I got back into it, and again, at that time, we're talking digitally programmable. They weren't even fully digital yet. But just the exciting things now that were happening in hearing aids, I got right back into it, kind of sucked back into it. And, from there, I worked in ENT for a while, and then knew I wanted to do something more. So fast forward to a different position at a private practice, and I felt, oh, this is where I want to be. This is where I can practice the way that will help people the most. I really felt ENT, serves a purpose, and we're helping those physicians diagnose very serious medical conditions and things. But the hearing aid, the rehab part of it, you just don't have, at least where I was, you just don't have enough time to do it the way I would like to do it. So private practice, I really felt like I found my home there. And then working for someone else, I thought, I really want to be doing this for myself.
Okay, I want to just take a quick pause there and comment on two things. I want to unpack that last point, but first I just want to make a comment because a couple episodes ago I had Dave Fabry on from Starkey, and I just kind of going off what you said about the technology and the leap that it took between sort of the 8-year hiatus before and after. And I think that's just a very interesting point because in some of the previous conversations that I've had on this podcast about what retailing hearing aids and selling hearing aids in the 90s and the early 2000s were like versus what it's like now. I think that especially for some of the younger professionals, like I don't think that it's appreciated or that point of just how much better off it is in this whole like industry, given that the technology has progressed to the point to where it's just so night and day different. And I think that the way that would like translate into market data or something like that would just be the patient satisfaction rate. But I just think about this job and how challenging it must have been when the product was so inferior to what it is today, which is like kind of to your point, it was almost like shocking when you came off your hiatus to see how dramatically better it had become.
Yeah, no question. And I when I think back, and I take students from UConn here, and I'll kind of always give a little history lesson on hearing devices because it really, when I sit back and think about it, it's mind blowing the advances that we have had in technology, and I feel really grateful to have seen all of that. Makes me feel a little old sometimes, but it is it's hard to kind of explain to students sometimes exactly what we were working with and how we would have to even order hearing aids. You had to know a lot about what that hearing aid did to order the correct technology at the time for the patient sitting in front of you. You had to be really familiar with the circuitry, and because you were ordering the circuit that you wanted, you were ordering the matrix that you needed, and it wasn't where you could just hook it up to a computer, show it the audiogram that you have, and you obviously have to do that to some degree now, but it was, I think you almost had to know more.
Well, I think that it's very interesting, like how that has all been, I think we look at like today's landscape, and you can just see that, like, to your point, it goes all the way to matching people to the proper solution. And so you hear a lot of these adages that, I think are kind of becoming outdated, which is a good thing. But it's like, people that buy a pair of hearing aids and they put them in the desk drawer and they never use them again. And, some of these like notions of how they're essentially alluding to the hit or miss, ratio of patient satisfaction. Some people maybe, you were able to match them to something that worked well, but like, man, there was a lot of feedback with that, and so there's just so many things that gave people a reason to abandon the whole pursuit of this. And I think that is a big reason why there's still this negative connotation that people have with this whole model and everything, is because a lot of it's rooted in previous generations, past experiences. And I think it's important for all of us to recognize that progression and appreciate where it is now, because I do think that like it's so dramatically advanced in every regard. And I think that that's a really positive aspect of the technology, if you will.
Absolutely. And just as you were talking about that, I'm thinking, we didn't have RICs back then. We were dealing with either, traditional behind the ears with custom ear molds, or ITE, so occlusion for people with, normal lows or near normal lows. Again, it was hard to get them to get help, because as soon as you put those hearing aids in, boy, it was hard to deal with that occlusion. So we can help just a greater range of people now because of the technology that we have. And yeah, feedback, nightmares about feedback. Just trying to control it. But you learned a whole lot about how hearing aids work, and a lot of that stuff, translates to the products that we're working with now. And in a lot of ways, experience matters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the other point I wanted to kind of unpack that you were making was, the point you made about the transition from working in an ENT to a private practice. And you said, I just didn't feel like I had the amount of time or the autonomy to sort of facilitate the kind of rehab treatment that you had wanted. Can you unpack that a little bit and just describe maybe what specifically it was in, when you're operating in something like, call it like, obviously this is generalizing, but like a standard ENT clinic versus what that was like when you moved into a private practice? Was it just so dominant with like the diagnostics and you were like turning people out, or can you just speak to that a little bit? I find that interesting.
Yeah, sure. And I can talk. I worked in, I guess, 2 different offices that were fairly similar in the way that they ran. I think it's fairly standard with most ENT offices, where you have your own schedule, but the physicians can bring back a stat test anytime. So we would call it the chart would, back when we all had paper charts, the chart would be in the box. So we would sometimes have 5 or 6 charts, people waiting to be tested while you're trying to do a hearing aid fitting. But you got all those people waiting to have tests. And the physicians relied on our test results to do what they needed to do. So it was just kind of this constant pressure to move things along. And, even if you wanted to spend more time, it was difficult to do that.
That's interesting. Okay, so then kind of going back to your story of you make this transition, you start working at a private practice. Where do things go from there?
So it was so nice to have a schedule that was all yours, and you were in, and I guess depends on the private practice that you're working at. I happen to have a boss who, while she wanted a full schedule, I was free to modify it as I needed, and was able, and it just felt like even the normal appointment time that we had there allowed for a whole lot more counseling to happen. And you were the professional, right? So they weren't seeing somebody else after you who was then going to talk to them about the hearing loss. It was you that was counseling them about their hearing loss and the effect and their need for hearing aids. Whereas sometimes in the ENT office, while we could have a short conversation, and they would ultimately go back to the ENT, who was the one that would then make that stronger recommendation. So it was on you now to have that conversation with the patient. And so, I had to learn, I think, better counseling techniques, and learn how to do the sort of motivational interviewing in the beginning of the appointment to get what the patient needed out of that visit. And then, where are we going with it, and making the patient a, partner in their care. and knowing that you are the one responsible for that. They're not going to somebody else after they see you who is then going to do some of this work. And I just love the fact that while you might have your next appointment waiting, you didn't have multiple people waiting to see you, and there wasn't that pressure.
Yeah, that's interesting. So basically, the patient flow was more manageable. You felt like you could dedicate more time. I mean, in your eyes, what is a proper hearing aid fitting allotment of time? That initial visit.
In my office, we do an hour. I think that can vary based on if it's a new user versus a
brand new patient.
Right. Versus somebody who's worn hearing aids for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
That certainly will vary. But, in terms of doing the programming and the verification and some education around whatever new product that they are using, an hour is what we allot. We have audiology assistants here. So there are times if we have a really full schedule and we need to shift some of the duties of the fitting to not the actual programming, but in terms of instructing them to put them in their ear and take them out and show them how to use the volume control, how to set up their Bluetooth. We will use audiology assistants for a lot of that stuff. So if we have to shorten the appointment, they can kind of take over and do some of the non-audiological stuff.
That's really cool. Okay, we'll come back to that piece. But going back to your story about, so you're at the practice. When did you become was it this practice that you bought, or did you end up starting your own practice? When did you become a practice owner?
So the practice that I worked in is not the first location of Best Life, but it is one of the locations that I took over.
Okay.
While I was working there, my mother got very ill. And as I was with her, it was a very quick illness, and she passed away within 5 months of getting sick. And it was one of those life events that changes you.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking at the time, I'm not getting any younger. She was 68 when she died, and I was 49. And I thought, and her mother before her had also died at 68. So I just had this thought process. If I only have this many years left on this planet, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? And private practice ownership was something that I always wanted, but sort of was a little bit nervous to take the leap. It's a scary thing. But at that point in time, I said, you know what, either I'm going to do it now or I'm not going to do it at all. And so when I came back to work after being with my mom, I said to the owner at the time that I was going to be leaving and start my own practice. And at that, started to investigate what I needed to do that. Did a lot of prep work, but I always say, no matter how prepared you think you are, it's going to be an adventure. And it was, yeah. Did I fully answer your question?
Absolutely. No, I think it's really interesting. I think that there are these kind of like life moments that happen that change your whole perspective. So you go off, you strike off, and you're going to do your own thing. Where's the first location of Best Life? Where in Connecticut?
So we're in Wallingford, Connecticut, and I had done a lot of research around location, looked at multiple towns, and my kind of theory is if there's one good private practice, Connecticut towns are not huge in general, and it would be hard to compete against another really good established private practice. So I really wanted to go somewhere where there was not that. So Wallingford happened to have a big rehab hospital that had an audiology department for like 30 plus years, that a few years before had closed the department. And so I knew there were a lot of people looking for a new home, new audiology home, and kept coming back to Wallingford as really a good place. I'd had some people tell me, well, other people have tried things there and it hasn't really worked. But I said, what, it's a good sized town. with a need for audiology. So this is where I landed. And it was close enough that a lot of my, former patients could follow me. I'm just thinking back in my mind, about that time period. It was certainly stressful. And, but, I wouldn't change anything for the world. It was character building, we'll say.
Well, so I was going to ask, what really stands out in your mind if you kind of chronicle this period, right? So what really stands out about maybe some of those initial fears before you even took the plunge, when you were doing your due diligence to decide, if this is going to work or not, and then maybe those first few formative years of owning a clinic, and what stands out in terms of some things that maybe were challenging or things that you really were surprised by, some success stories, whatever it might be. When you think back to this period when you were just sort of getting your feet underneath you, what stands out in your mind?
Initially, of course, you're thinking, I'll open the doors. Will anybody show up?
Yeah, for sure.
That's the biggest fear. The challenge in the beginning was getting credentialed with the insurance companies. And I figured I have the time, I'm gonna do it myself. And I did do a lot of it myself, but I did it after very stressful months, get other people involved. But, I went to Kim Cabot's boot camp. I learned, and I had, in my previous positions, immersed myself in the insurance piece of it. I felt like it was my duty to know, if I was talking to a patient about their benefit, it was my duty to know as much as I could about what they could expect to be paying. And so I really had a long history of working with either the insurance company directly or with our billing department on the billing. It was something that I really felt was important to know, even though it's not fun. It's not a fun part of what we do, but I think it's important. So even with all that background in it, it was a challenge, very stressful. I remember I got shingles during that point in time, and the doctor looked at me. He said, "Are you under any stress?" Oh, yes, I am. So get your shingles shot, everyone, if you were 50 or over. So that was the biggest challenge going into it, getting credentialed with the insurance companies. Because, of course, the first question people ask is, do you take my insurance? And we still deal with that challenge. We can go there later with managed care and all of that. And marketing, learning how to market your business. I had someone, it was actually at one of the manufacturers when I was talking about starting up the business. Somebody at one of the manufacturers had given me some really good, what I think is really good advice. He said, get yourself some used equipment and spend your money on marketing. And I thought, it really does make a lot of sense. So I did exactly that. I found a used booth that fit my space perfectly. I was able to find some really good audiometer, tympanometer, OEEs used, but still in great shape. And so the investment in the equipment wasn't outrageous. And then I could take the funds that I had and invest into marketing. And then I fell in love with marketing. I really enjoy that aspect of it. So that's been a fun part of building the business, is learning more, because as we know, if we knew exactly what worked all the time, everybody'd be doing it. So it's a moving target.
For sure.
And, it's fun when things work and not so fun when they don't. But that's all part of business ownership and part of what I love about it.
Yeah. So, okay. So you kind of, you cross that threshold, you establish yourself, you kind of, become capable of or I guess taking insurance, or certified, if you will. And then you also start to market your practice and go down the route of starting to drum up business. So then you kind of progress, and where does your story then kind of lead? I know you have multiple clinics now. What was that period like between getting to the point to where you were ready to expand?
So I opened the practice in April of 2019. And if you think about the time period between 2019 and now we had something called COVID.
Uh-huh.
And so about a year into it, I had two things happen. One is we had a fire in our building and my entire space got flooded. So I had to close down for like a week. And I thought that was just awful. But okay, we closed down, we got it all dried out, back in business, and we were actually having a really good sort of I remember it was March at the time. And then we started hearing about this thing called COVID, and as it got deeper into it, and a month after that flood, I had to close the practice down for COVID. And it was a scary time. I was only a year old practice. And you didn't know, everybody I'm sure has that memory of that period of time where you just didn't know what was going to happen. And when you close the doors, when could you open them again? You didn't know. And at that time, I was taking a lot of third party because I was a new practice and I was trying to get people in the door. And so it was actually a little bit of a saving grace because third party payments are lagging, right? They pay you about after the trial period. So I had money coming in from the third parties to at least pay my bills. And at that time, it was just me and one staff member. So it was manageable in terms of the bills. Got through about 2 months, we could open the doors. And I never stopped marketing during that time period. I was kind of looking at all of the different advice and looking at other sort of crises that have happened in our history. And while you feel like you want to shut the spigot off because you don't want to pay for the marketing, everything that I was reading about history of this kind of thing was, don't stop. Do some marketing in some fashion. We obviously couldn't do it all the traditional way and market the same things, but we could still let people know we were out there. So I did that. I continued to market. And so as soon as we could open the doors, which is about 2 months later, and I never really, I came to the office every day. I talked to patients on the phone every day. I went out, to the car in gloves and masks and did repair. So I never fully just shut the doors and you can't communicate with us. But as soon as we could open the doors and be fully operational, people were more than willing to come back in. So, you breathe a little sigh of relief. And I think in that period, we were kind of transitioning out of the isolation periods and dealing with COVID. We now had protective gear and things like that. Then sort of went full steam ahead with the marketing and had explosive growth between then. In 2021 was an amazing year for a lot of people because we had that demand build up. We had people recognizing that they had hearing loss because of the masks. We had all of these factors, and 2021 was this incredible year for us. It was exciting. It'd be nice if it was like that every year. But it did, allow me to think, okay, do I want to do more than this? And then the practice I told you that I had been working at, I found out that, the owner was interested in selling, and he had, and I knew it was a great practice. I knew a lot about it, so it just made sense to me. He had another practice in another town in Ansonia that he basically said he wouldn't sell one without the other. And so, okay, what the heck? What's another one?
Yeah.
And this is another case of where as much work as you think it's going to be, yeah, it's going to be way more than that. So the business transaction of actually purchasing those two additional offices took a lot of time. I'm going to say a good 7-8 months to kind of get through that, with the financial piece of it, the legal piece of it, all of it. And it was, certainly there were times when I said, oh my, what am I doing? What am I doing? And why am I doing this? You do sort of have to think about, why am I doing this? Because that is the thing about scaling, right? Does it make sense?
Yep.
You have this one office that seems to be chugging along pretty well. Why would you do this? And certainly that went through my head. But I felt like I knew this other office, and I think my thinking was, that's probably going to fall into corporate hands if I don't take it over. And I would like to see it stay in local, independent practice. But that is the challenge of having multiple locations. How do you keep that independent local feel when now you have multiple locations, you're different? And none of the locations are very far apart. Our farthest one is maybe a half hour. We're about a half hour from each other. But it's still, a lot of what I did to build up the Wallingford location was local networking, talking to other business owners and working with the local physicians and things like that. Being in the local newspaper. And now I need to do that times 3, and you're one, as the owner, you're one person. So how do you get your staff to care enough to also want to do those things? And that I'm finding, well, there are a lot of challenges in doing this. That's one of them, is keeping that local feel when you, on the other hand, want to create systems so that we're all doing a lot of things the same way. Right. You want to keep that. Each office has its own.
It's kind of paradoxical. It's like you're trying to keep the feel and the vibes of the original Best Life Hearing Center, but once you scale it, you sort of have to delegate. You have to give up, some of that control. And really the byproduct of that is that, maybe there are some inconsistencies that you're not crazy about. But it's almost the trade-off of growth, right? And I guess that's probably one of your biggest challenges, is how do you have the right, hire the right personnel, have the right group that is bought into this, whatever you would kind of, however you would like distill down the essence of Best Life Hearing Center. And then how do you embody that more or less?
That is 100% the biggest challenge. It's been about a year since I've had all 3, and we're still working on creating those systems, because the other two, even though they had the same owner, functioned very independently. And so they each did things very differently, and then very different from what we were doing here. So it has been a work in progress to get everybody on the same page in terms of all of the processes. And, I learned quickly that I needed to have some patience around that, because I wanted everybody to do the same thing we were doing right away, and including, so I use Counselor as my OMS, and they were using something different. And so when I transitioned and kind of threw Counselor at them, there's a learning curve there that I didn't quite appreciate totally. Because now I had been using it. And so I needed to take a step back, and because it's such a great system, but you have to know how to enter the information so that it's usable on the other end. And I would say that's still, and I learn things about Counselor every day that we can utilize that maybe we're not. So that's been challenging on many levels. And then conveying to the staff having this vision in your mind is not enough. You have to communicate it to the staff all the time. And when you're also a clinician and not just an owner, when you have a busy patient schedule on top of trying to run 3 offices, it did get to be too much for me. So I hired an office manager, which has helped tremendously to help streamline things, because she can be places when I can't be. And she, that's her total focus is operations. So that was a huge stress reliever for me to have that other person that can do a lot of the things that I was doing.
For sure. I mean, every time I have these conversations, they sort of bring to mind past episodes. And the one that's really coming to mind right now is the conversation I had with Jason Leyendecker, who has a chain of clinics in Minnesota, and kind of a similar trajectory. Started out single location, multi-location. And I think what was very interesting about his story was how he has, and I'm sure you felt this too, is like you're not just a clinician, but you're an entrepreneur. And, so much of that side, like, kind of starts to take over and dominates your time and your energy and all that. And, a lot of that is like, as you scale, it's about becoming a leader. And so you have to figure out, like, it's like all things with becoming an entrepreneur, which is you kind of almost have to teach yourself everything. You have to be self-taught for so much, that's, I think, one of the biggest aspects of it. And so, he was talking about how he cultivated really like and fostered leadership, and how challenging that was, because innately wasn't really the kind of person that was drawn to that, but you're sort of thrust into it. And so, he had a lot of really interesting insight around how he was able to sort of foster that. He, made it an effort to like read a lot of these different books. And, so much of it though was like really actively working on his communication style to his team. And I just found this to be really interesting about, again, you're not just an audiologist, but you're like this, you're also on this career arc of becoming more and more of this entrepreneur, and all that comes with it. And you take on a lot, and it's not something that you read out of a textbook. You sort of have to, sort of experience it and learn from those experiences. And I just find that element about private practice is so interesting, because every person you talk to, there's a lot of similarities, but everybody kind of had to strike out and learn this stuff on their own. And it's just fascinating to me to hear how people sort of teach themselves this stuff when you have to kind of almost seek it out and just figure out a way to like acquire that skill set, more or less.
Yeah, I can totally relate to what you're saying about Jason. I also really just devoured books on business, on leadership, on motivation. Always could talk about whatever book I'm reading. I'm just reading Traction. You're familiar with that one. And I also had a really great group of practice owners. So at the time when it was just the Wallingford office, I was with EarQ before EarQ, and AHA merged, and
right.
So now I'm with CQ Partners. But starting with the EarQ, we had this group of practice owners that started meeting actually during COVID, sort of my lifeline to be like, okay, what's happening out there, with other people. It was really, it was an important part of that time in the practice development. And so created some really strong relationships with other practice owners, people you could rely on for advice or to just commiserate with, in the moment. And that group, we met every week via Zoom, and there was always a topic around mostly leadership, motivation. We talked a little bit about the nitty-gritty, the operations and marketing and things, but it was really a lot of that leadership development. And so this group, a lot of the same people continue to this day. Every Friday, at noon we meet. And so cultivating relationships like that has really helped me. I'm also in one of Don Hyman's Entree Audiology groups with these amazing practice owners that have been doing this a whole lot longer than me. And, I have learned so much from them also. And that's been hugely important for me to not be just in this little bubble trying to figure it out on my own, to know there is support out there and people can lead you in the right direction. And even in other aspects of what I would have to do. So say when I was going through the legal stuff with the practice acquisition, I just found this really great lawyer who I feel like I could not have gone through this without her. She just was so smart in that things that I could never have known on my own.
Yeah.
And same thing with my accountant. Like I think I'm on my third accountant because I was just never comfortable. Now I have someone I really can rely on and trust. So knowing that just the relationship piece of all the other segments of what you do are so important that you can't do it alone. You got to find good people to do it with you.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. Like, again, there's so many stories like this of during the pandemic, people sort of found ways to collaborate and like you said, commiserate. And I think that a lot of people like kind of held on to a lot of that. And I think that that's been a positive byproduct of it is these groups that I think are pretty pervasive in this industry now of, these small networks of like-minded, individuals that are in similar situations across the country that can share a lot of their experiences. And again, I think this whole notion of like, people all can kind of relate to these things. Managed care is a perfect example of it, right? Like, I think everybody is kind of going through this right now of figuring out how do you adapt to that. But it's an example that's a visceral example that I think is the epitome of like, you could, try to figure this out on your own, sure. And I'm sure many people have and will, but I think a lot of people are working together in a sense of like, what is the right approach given my circumstances, given, because again, it's not a universal thing. And I think that's what's pretty cool about what I feel like I'm observing in this industry right now, which is, I haven't been in this industry all that long. I mean, I joined Oak Tree full time in 2016 or 2017, but it really does feel, and I guess the pandemic maybe was the marker of like when this shift really felt like it took effect, but it feels like there's a sense of collaborativeness across the professionals, particularly the audiologists that, are doing a lot of this mind melding and sharing of experiences. And so I think that, again, it's rising tide lifts all ships, but, I think everybody doesn't need to think of each other as competition. I think that there's a lot of good that can come from just simply putting yourself out there and saying, these are the challenges I'm facing. Who else is facing similar challenges? What are you all doing to kind of solve these things?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I know you and I had talked at one point about, being a member of your state organization. And so even at the state level where truly some of us could be competition with each other, there's a lot of that, collaboration happening even with people in your own town or, a few towns over. But we, being part of the state organization and knowing that we're all working toward the same goals, and there's enough people with hearing loss out there for everyone to service, that I will try to kind of foster some of those connections sometimes. But that's why I do feel like it's important for me to be part of the state organization. And we're a small state, we always say we're small but mighty. Our state organization has been really solid. We had Dr. Kathy Alex had started it, and she was the president for many, many, many years and recently passed the torch. But there's been just a core group of people that have kept this organization strong and kept it going. And now we're in the situation where we're needing new, younger audiologists to take part, and they have been. And it's been so nice to see their input and their perspective. And now they're, we're planning our next conference, and they're taking a leadership role in that conference planning, and just having that different perspective and seeing them also have that collaborative feel. It's so nice. And we have also a strong, we have employ a lobbying group, as your state organization does, to keep an eye on audiology issues. We have a strong lead on the governmental side of things, which is also so important these days with scope of practice issues and things like that. So yes, join your state organization, be a part of it. And they always need help.
Yeah, I mean, with my job, I've traveled to a lot of state academies. Thank you for the invite to the Connecticut Academy and the invite to speak up there. Because I will say that I was very impressed with, like you said, it's a small but mighty group. It seemed like it was a pretty crowded room for being a small state. There were quite a few audiologists there. It was, in all honesty, one of the better state-run academies that I had attended. So kudos to you all. You're definitely doing the right thing. And I'm with you that I think that it's, as somebody that's part of the younger cohort, I personally feel that it's very important for young people to be engaged in this stuff, because I think that it's a great way to meet and network with everybody in your state. But I think it gives you the opportunity to essablish yourself and your voice, your generational perspective, the way that a 30-something or a 20-something, odd young professional is going to be thinking about this industry is going to be a lot different than somebody that's, maybe at the tail end of their career that isn't thinking about what this space is going to look like in 10 to 20 years. And so I think that it's just, in my opinion, a really awesome way to establish yourself in your community as somebody that is engaged in wanting to progress things forward. Because I think that, to your point, it's going to get to the point to where you're kind of the heir apparent, more or less, of who's going to assume that role of leading the charge. And so again, I've just become very invested in this whole notion of because I speak to so many different audiologists in different parts of their career that all speak very positively about the effect that getting involved has had on their career. The last episode I just did with Tish Gaffney, she really attributes so much of her career success to the fact that when she was really young, she got involved in what was NAFTA, which was the predecessor of Student Academy of Audiology. Didn't know that until I talked to her. But it's, one of those things where you just can, I think it just sets you up for things that you won't really realize are going to be secondary benefits of doing the types of doors that it's going to open. So again, that's my testimonial of why I think it's important to be engaged in this stuff, because it really, I think it really does lend itself to future career opportunities that you can't predict.
Yeah, and I could tell a personal story on that note. So when I started on the board at the academy, I was working at the ENT office and was on the board with someone who had previously worked at the ENT office. And she knew that I would wanted to sort of get out of there and wanted to be in private practice. So when she heard of a practice opportunity, and it was somebody else on the board, kind of steered her in my direction. And so having that connection, and that was one of the things about private practice that I thought it's hard to get into a job at private practice, because people will usually go the networking route as opposed to posting an ad. And so that was the way I got into a private practice, was that, somebody I knew somebody and introduced me and said, she's interested, and that's how that worked out for me. And I've seen that happen in that space. And I think there is there was always a part of me that wants to have a legacy of helping the profession. And, that's why I take UConn students. I like to teach them. And I think what you were saying about, young people bringing new perspectives, it's nice to have that balance of having the young people with new perspectives and then I don't want to use the word old people. But
seasoned vets.
There you go. I like it. Having that historical perspective, just the mix of the two is really great. And I think that especially helps when we're looking at the legislation and how it may affect us, the seasoned vets, as you call us. We may have a bigger awareness of how a certain piece of legislation may affect us based on history. So I think it's really important to have that mix of people. And I think we have that now in Connecticut, which is really, really nice.
That's cool. So as we come to the close here, where you're at now versus where you were, from the beginning, it's really cool to hear the progression. So what does 2024, like, what are the things that you're excited about? What are kind of the, I know we've talked about managed care being, an obstacle, a challenge, but where's, we're kind of at the start of the year, like what's on your forecast for your clinics, and what's kind of top of mind for you right now?
I would say it does have to do with managed care. I was crunching some 2023 numbers last week because, numbers will always give you perspective that maybe weren't aware of. And looking at our managed care. So we currently take 4 different managed care plans. And in crunching the numbers, we discovered that 50% of our time goes to managed care patients, and it accounts for 15% of our revenue. And so that was really eye-opening. And looking at what we're taking, I'm going to reduce the number from 4 companies to 2 companies. It's always part of what I'm doing to see how we can manage managed care better. It just is that is going to continue, and it's going to be ongoing to figure out how we do that. But that perspective that we're spending all of this time with these people with managed care that of course we want to help, and many of them are patients we have seen for a very long time that probably started out or did start out private pay, and because of their change in insurance have. So, you certainly want to continue to see those people. There are so many factors, when you're looking at what plans do I take, what plans don't I take, but it has to work for you. It has to, the numbers have to make sense. So we're drilling down on that and how to fine tune that a little bit. We'll be working on continuing to work on our processes and systems. Hiring, I just have 1 position open right now, but looking at our hiring processes, there's so many things in 2024, but I'll just say it's always a work in progress. Like, I know there's no destination we're going to reach and say, okay, we're done. It's always going to be continual. So, I'll do it for as long as I enjoy it.
I think that whole notion of managing managed care is probably like, if you had to boil down, what the most popular topic would be at like AAA or something like that, I bet that would probably fill a room, fuller than, yeah, right. And that is the interesting thing, that there is no silver bullet. I mean, it's, to your point, really hard to just say, well, I'm just not going to see managed care patients, because what about all of your existing patients and all of the collateral damage that could do to your brand? Not to mention that it's just not consistent with most providers, like that they're in the business of helping people. So it's very, very challenging. But for me, again, this all kind of comes back to how do you reconcile with that notion? That's such a stark, the like a shocking statistic. 50% of your time is dedicated to a segment of your customers that represents 15% of your revenue. So like that to me is where I think that over the next few years, the market will have to sort this out. And I think that, one of the ways that will be very interesting to watch is how you can sort of employ or deploy like audiology assistants and some of these different types of labor. And I just keep thinking that you have to find efficiencies, and that seems to be one area that there's a lot of potential. But can you share maybe why that's not as simple as it is? I mean, how much of that, again, this is probably oversimplifying, but the analogy that I always think about is the dental model, right? You only see the dentist for a small portion of time when you go in to get your teeth cleaned and you get the x-rays. You're primarily engaging with the hygienist. So what's the analogy to this industry? Is there an equivalent where you as the audiologist can go and you can spend a little bit of personal time with that patient who you've really enjoyed working with over the last, 10 years, but you're not having to dedicate that whole patient visit? Can that, I mean, is that like viable, or where does that whole thinking break down in your opinion?
I think that's absolutely viable. And it's the model that we're transitioning to here. I referenced it a little bit when I was talking about the hearing aid fitting. But we do much like the dental model. If someone is coming in strictly for a hearing aid cleaning, they see the assistant. I think the challenge that I have, and where, we'll be exploring how other people are doing this, is charging appropriately and training it at the front desk who needs to see the assistant and who absolutely needs to see the audiologist. And so that, because sometimes there's some confusion there and patients can be confused about why is this appointment more than this appointment. So there's a lot of patient education that goes around making them aware that it's similar to a dental model, that if you're coming in for the cleaning, the assistants are trained to work with your hearing aids in that way, but they're not going to be programming the devices in any way for you.
Let me ask you this question really quick. When it comes to that patient education piece, do you find that the patient education is more warranted, or I guess in more demand by the patients of those that are already existing patients and accustomed to this model, versus the people that are brand new, not accustomed to this model, and maybe they're more receptive to it because it's more consistent with other healthcare models like the dental model?
I would say that, yeah, you're spot on there, that people that we have seen for a long period of time that are used to coming in to seeing the audiologist, even if they're just coming in for a cleaning, they like to chat with you. They like to be social with you. And if you're not doing much more than cleaning their hearing aid, then it makes sense to transition them to the assistant. But there will be some pushback sometimes, so there is training on the staff level. And, I think it's important on the part of the audiologist to assure them you're seeing someone who's more than capable of doing what you need them to do. You're in great hands, and I will see you at your annual or whatever it will be. And we've successfully done this in Wallingford and Cheshire. In the other location, we're currently training an audiology assistant there, so that model can be consistent in all three offices, and so that the charges can be consistent in all three offices, that kind of thing. And I do think that's the future, because we have to deal with this lower reimbursement. We have to deal with seeing more people and effectively using our time so that we can remain profitable, and be able to help as many people as possible at the same time. So I think that is the future.
Yeah. That's sort of the sense that I've been gathering, is that it's, the fact of the matter is that it's not going away. It's only going to become more pervasive in terms of whether it's managed care or just insurance, broadly speaking. I think that this is just sort of part and parcel with like the way that things are moving, where this is a benefit. And, I think that here in this period of time right now, it's really challenging because it's so inverted versus the existing model, which has really been lower patient volume, higher profitability per patient. And so I think that model is totally inverting right now. So it's painful, but I think the other side of this, and I don't know how it will shake out. I don't know if like the revenue opportunities are going to just be I think what's undoubtedly going to happen is there's just going to be more people that are engaging with this model. Now, today, those patients are less profitable on a per patient basis because of the low reimbursement rates and because of the pervasiveness of managed care. But I think that what will become interesting to see is, are there other ways to generate revenue from those patients? Maybe it will be things like new treatments, like linear or something that's for totally different kinds of, symptoms that are, pretty consistent with a lot of the patients where, in the past, you're predominantly just, facilitating treatment for amplification. Maybe in the future, you're also doing a lot of treatment for tinnitus. And, so again, I just think that it's not yet to be seen what that's going to look like. But I think that what is the exciting aspect of this is that more people are coming into the office. And I think what will be really interesting in like a few years is, how can you monetize those people, for lack of better words, in a way that isn't egregious. It's just, I think that, again, like maybe the best place to be looking are some of these adjacent healthcare industries to see, because this has all already happened in their industries. What did dental do when this all kind of transpired? Well, they started to diversify into different little ancillary add-on services. You could get your teeth whitened, you could do these different kinds of services that, you could buy more or less when you came into the office. So I think that it's just sort of it's hard to, I always take a optimistic viewpoint, but I can see how it's like, it's easier said than done, but it does seem to me that there is a light at the end of the tunnel here, in the sense that I personally think that, imagine the inverse of this. Imagine if, less people were coming in and your profitability was getting slashed. The reason that the profitability is getting slashed is because so many people are coming in now. It's like economies of scale, more or less.
Yeah, I think what you were talking about in terms of adding services, that's been something been working on also. In Wallingford, we've been doing more and more cerumen removal, and that in this office, we happen to have a nice space to do it. And in the other offices, it's a little more challenging to figure out where we can offer full, irrigation, suction, manual cerumen removal. It's harder to do it in the other offices, but I'm trying to figure out a way, because I think that's something here that people have been, they've had bad experiences elsewhere. The convenience of being able to do it right when you see it and not having to reschedule an appointment to send them out to do it. That has been one of the things, the add-on ancillary services that you're referring to. And I am always looking for things like that, because I also agree with you, that is what we should be. We should be audiology specialty care. That's what we are. And that's obviously been a topic in the industry that, hearing aids alone are probably not going to do it for you in the future. But there are so many opportunities out there. I think my challenge is, there's all these shiny objects, right? And I need to focus. And the fact of the matter is, we also want to be really good at hearing aids, because there's also a lot of not great hearing aid care out there. And so we want to be the place that's known, when you go there, you're going to get specialized care. We're not just popping first fit devices on your ears, and have a nice day. So I also want that to be our primary focus, because we know we're good at that. But I am always looking for, other services to add, because I think you're right about that. We need to look at, what does specialty care mean, and what should we be offering?
Couldn't agree more. Well, Jennifer, this has been a really interesting and fun conversation. Thanks so much for coming on today. I've really enjoyed hearing your story. So thanks for everybody who tuned in here to the end. We will chat with you next time. Cheers.